Hi, my name is Kathy Fitzgerald, and I am a parent and a professional who've worked in the disability field for over 30 years. I'm here today representing the Disability Law Center in the state of Alaska to talk to you a little bit about Medicaid waivers and sort of the background of waivers, where they came from, and kind of what they're about in this section. Really, it all started, I think, back in the Kennedy administration. They had a sister with disabilities, and they recognized if they had so much trouble trying to figure out how to get supports and services and have things happen for her, and they had all these resources, how was the rest of the country supposed to be able to help their loved ones with disabilities? And so they designed a system that really was made up of three different sections. The first section is one that looks at training and best practice. And so all across the country, every state and territory has this system. So Alaska, of course, has this system. And in our state, our training impetus is called the Center for Human Development, and it is part of the Center for Excellence that every um, state and territory has, affiliated with the universities. And their job is to train professionals, paraprofessionals, families on how to work with individuals with disability. But broader than that, they're also responsible for promoting best practice, research, that sort of thing, so that it gets out and down and people have access to that sort of material. The second entity, if you think of it as a three-legged stool, the second leg of the stool would be the Centers for Change or the Councils for Change, and in our state, it's called the Governor's Council on Disabilities and Special Education. And they have a very unique role in all of the states and territories. And their job is really to uh, advocate for systems change, to promote systems change and best practice, to advise the governor and the legislature on how things are working, and to ensure that things are happening around the state that hopefully should be happening. So these councils are, I believe there are 26 individuals on the council, and they're all have specific mandates. So there's a special ed teacher, for example. There's an insurance person. There's the commissioner's office, looking at health and social services. So any area that really kind of touches a person's life should have some sort of representation. So I think one of the most exciting things about the mandate of this council is that 60% of the council members have to have either a disability or be the parent or close relative to somebody who has a disability, with the idea being that they experience services in Alaska, and so they can make better recommendations to the governor and to the legislature. The third leg of the stool is the legal leg, and in our state that's called the Disability Law Center of Alaska, and their job is to protect your civil rights, to make sure that you're not discriminated against because of a disability, uh, to work with you, or if you have issues around entitlements. They really are protection and advocacy. We're going to talk about what a developmental disability is and the definition of a developmental disability. In the state of Alaska, we use the federal definition, and it means that you have to have a severe and chronic disability that's expected to be lifelong. It's not something that you would think you would grow out of. It has to happen before the age of 22. This is really a critical component of that definition. And you have to have substantial limitations in 3 out of 5 life domains if you're 15 or under, or 3 out of 7 if you're over the age of 16. That would include self-care, receptive or expressive language, learning, mobility, self-direction, capacity for independent living, or economic self-sufficiency. So in the state of Alaska, the developmental process system looks something like this. If you believe that your child or someone you care about has a developmental disability, first you need to complete that eligibility criteria paperwork. My suggestion to everyone is that you have assistance completing this form. The people who will be reviewing that are looking for uh, things that really tell them or describe to them the functionality of the person. So in our state, we have something called the STAR program, Short Term Assistance and Referral, and every community or every region has access to a STAR program. And you're going to want to have those people help you complete that eligibility. In fact, all of the paperwork that you need to turn in is really good to have the STAR people helping you because they know how to describe your loved one in a way that the state can really picture how they function. Um, at one point in our history, we had people within the state who actually would come out and meet the families or meet the individual. And so they had a good idea of the level of function of each person. But now, our state people really don't have the opportunity to actually meet and see people. So, how you fill out this paperwork makes it that much more critical because they're depending upon that paperwork to determine whether or not your son or daughter or loved one really meets that federal criteria for a developmental disability. In the state of Alaska, the only person who can deem an individual eligible for DD services are those state uh, people who review the forms. So your doctor could say to you, well, you have cerebral palsy. And that's not from the state's perspective, DD eligibility, because you could have cerebral palsy and it really not impact significantly how you function. You might just have a slight limp as opposed to uh, be limited to needing a lot of mobility supports and services. So again, that paperwork with the STAR project helping you fill that out is how the state determines whether or not you meet eligibility. So let's assume that the STAR folks have helped you fill out your paperwork and you know that there's going to be a little bit of assistance available to you to help with services. You can fill out at the same time and have the STAR people help you fill out something called a registry review form. All of these forms are on the internet, but it's really good again to have somebody helping you fill them out because this registry review form is the form that's used or the tool that's used by the state to determine how significant your disability is, how quickly you might come off of the registry to receive services. So, looking at that form, which is a weighted form, uh, having somebody help you is important. Um, Lots of families and people don't recognize all the assistance that they just automatically give to their children. And so this helps you look at it from a different perspective. So you have the eligibility paperwork filled out, you've done the registry review form, um, the paperwork is submitted to the Senior and Disability Services part of the Department of Social Services in our state. They review it and they determine that you are indeed eligible for services, that you do really have a developmental disability. And they'll send you a letter that says you've been deemed eligible for DD services, and they will give you in your community the list of agencies or agency if you're in a small community and maybe only have one provider. They'll tell you where you can go to receive uh, grant supported services, and those are really minimal supports that oftentimes when you're a young family or a young child may be all that you need. But as people get older and their disabilities perhaps are more severe, that's the purpose of being on this wait list registry, hoping for being selected for full service. Full service is really what we mean when we talk about a waiver. A waiver is actually a way for the state um, uh, to provide those services through federal funding match. And it really looks at comprehensive services. It's designed to say, what does the person need? What kinds of supports will help them become more productive and part of their community? So finally, we're going to talk about the selection. So uh, the folks at SDS are going to be looking at that waitlist criteria that you filled out, the review form, and if you score significantly enough, you could be one of 50 people who are removed from that registry review or waitlist, as it's known, every year. So again, uh, the weight that's given to that form is critical for how soon you're able to come off the registry and receive service. So, as I mentioned earlier, those waivers are funded partially by the federal government and partially by the state. And that partial funding is actually through Medicaid. So the Medicaid system is really a pretty broad system with lots of different programs in it. So the ones that we're thinking about in the disability world that typically impact us would be that big center circle, the Medicaid sort of insurance, thinking about what that is. Let me give you a little history about Medicaid, and perhaps that might help. So I'm really old, so I can remember being in the ninth grade and the Goldwater Johnson uh, candidacy debate. And one of the hot topics in that election was something called Medicaid. And Johnson really wanted to have this sort of safety net for people who were really poor so that they would have access to health care and not be hungry. And so that was the premise of that Medicaid system, if you would, looking at poverty, because poverty was, his whole administration, Johnson's administration, was all about poverty in the country and bringing people out of poverty. And so um, the Medicaid system really started out as this safety net and still serves as a safety net today. And thinking about that broad eligible category, the very first thing that you had to be in order to get Medicaid had to do with financial eligibility, okay? And that broader picture of Medicaid provides for our focus of people, insurance coverage, hospitals, doctors. In our state, we cover uh, occupational therapy, speech therapy, prescription drugs. Those are all things that are paid for out of Medicaid. And if you think about Medicaid from the perspective of that sort of healthcare system, even though it's much broader, when we're looking at waivers and as we get through this process, we'll talk more about the importance of, of thinking about it from that medical perspective um, as part of the service delivery. There are four particular programs that we want to talk about from a disability standpoint. The first, of course, is Denali Kid Care, and that came about as part of the SCHIP programs across the country. looking at having health coverage for children, recognizing how important it was for kids to have access to good health care. And so, Denali Kid Care is a way for families who might not otherwise be able to afford health care insurance, and there is a criteria or limitation there for eligibility of how much you can make in order to be eligible for Denali Kid Care. But it provides health care coverage for your children, not for the family, but for the children in that household. The second circle is Tephra, and it stands for something like tax equity reform. It had to do with how it was tied to funding to a bill many years ago, but it really is a way of simply providing health care coverage for children who have a disability or a chronic medical condition. And the exciting thing about Tephra is that it waives the family income. Because remember, uh, general Medicaid is based on low income. So many families were found to have children with significant high medical costs that their health insurance that they might have privately either ran out or they couldn't pay for was over the amount. This doesn't look at the family income, it only looks at what a child would make, and so obviously children are not going to be over resourced for Medicaid. So that's an exciting piece. We have up in the yellow circle something called ATAP, and that's Alaska Temporary Assistance Program. And that's what we think about back in the Johnson era of being typical Medicaid. So if you're a single mom, for example, with children and can't afford to work and have your children in daycare and need additional assistance for up to a period of 60 months, you can access ATAP, which will give you a monthly stipend and provide health care for your family. And then finally, the really critical piece from our perspective today has to do with the purple circle, and that's the waiver circle. And that provides um, both the health coverage, but also access to the community, those community services through the waiver that is deemed necessary for the person to have a good quality of life. So, in order to get that waiver, you have to meet the DD eligible criteria, meet the institutional level of care, and meet the financial eligibility. So in this case, under the waivers, if the uh, child is under 18, they waive the family income and they only look at the child's income. So it really is a matter of as the Tephra looking at the individual who with a chronic disability is chances are never going to be over resourced. I want to point out a really significant, important distinction about this Medicaid waiver. Um, it is that you meet an institutional level of care. So it's in lieu of being in an institution, uh, you might find yourself selecting a waiver to receive help and support in the community as opposed to an institution. So the criteria eligibility is important. Um, that you meet, you can have a developmental disability and not meet the level of care for an institution. So that pretty much wraps up sort of the general Medicaid overview. Join us for the next segment and we're going to go over what waivers are and how you get one.